In Kyiv, thank you so much for joining us.
Joining us now is retired Air Force Special Operations Commander and Defense Intelligence Technology Innovator, Major Glenn Ignazio. Glenn, welcome.
Good to be back with you.
Hey, as John Huddy just mentioned there are images of Russian resupply convoys headed to eastern Ukraine. The so-called Butcher of Syria has now been appointed to lead the entire Russian army. Does this indicate a new strategy from Putin, and are we potentially looking at an even bloodier war?
Yeah, I think it is a strategy. I mean, they sort of did the blitzkrieg in the beginning and tried to get as far as they could and extended the logistics chain and really got themselves schwacked with all the operations. So they're pulling back more to the border. I think they're regrouping, and they definitely are rearming and refreshing themselves. And with the new general, he's a brutal guy. I mean, we saw in Mariupol, Kyiv, and others, is that you see the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, these missiles flying into apartment buildings. These are not military targets. We saw in Syria that they either starve out or they bomb out their cities. That's their strategy. We've seen that in Ukraine, and I believe that he's pulling back, emphasizing and building his forces, and then is going to start pushing further through the Donbass regions and even possibly to Odessa. That's one of the last ports open to Ukraine.
Right. So over the weekend, we saw UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He surprised many when he went to Kyiv and toured the war-torn city with President Zelensky. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked if Joe Biden would do something like this. I want you to hear what she said.
What I will tell you is we're not currently planning a trip by the President of the United States to Ukraine. What is most important to the Ukrainian leadership is that we are expediting weapons and getting them the assistance and security systems they need.
So, General Ignazio, what do you make of Johnson's trip to Kyiv, and should President Biden visit Ukraine?
I think his visit is rather significant, especially, his presence is really good as far as, NATO and the UK being a very firm, strong partner of NATO and part of NATO, excuse me. So his visit there and his presence is very strong to show that that support is there. And it's, of course, a very dangerous region. So that's very, very significant for him to visit. As far as Biden travel in there, I don't see that happening. One, it's a very high risk war area. But at the same time, if we look at historically from any kind of press engagements and trips that he's done, he hasn't done well. They've controlled him. They've really mitigated any risks. So even though it may be significant, and I'm glad the UK minister was there, I don't see Biden making this trip for more ways than one, as you can imagine.
Well, there have been unconfirmed reports suggesting that chemical weapons may have been used in the besieged southern Ukrainian port of Mariupol. Meanwhile, Zelensky claims that retreating Russian troops are booby-trapping Ukrainian streets. I mean, Biden's called Putin a war criminal. He talks tough, but it hasn't hindered Russia. At what point does greater action need to be taken, and what does that look like?
Yeah, Putin, and again, historically, as you can see, with President Trump, he was a very strong, very vocal person, like it or not. And with Biden, it's just talk, talk, talk. And what I'm trying to say is that when you look at Putin, it's all about action and strength. And so when you see these movements or you see these possibilities, say, chemical warfare being used in Ukraine, I mean, that is a solid line that should not be crossed. And if it does, there needs to be distinct and established operations that will be against Russia. Unfortunately, we saw in the Obama and, of course, Biden administration before in Syria, chemical weapons, a red line in the sand, and then it was moved and it was moved and it was moved. So he was part of that administration. I don't see that he's going to take much action, but we would have to. Otherwise, Russia's going to feel like they have complete carte blanche to continue on escalating as much as they can.
Yeah, well, there's no question that that under President Trump, I don't think this would have ever happened, this invasion into Ukraine. But let me ask you this. Austria's chancellor became the first leader of a European Union country to visit Moscow since the start of the invasion. And the chancellor described the meeting with Putin as very direct, open, and tough. What does it tell you that Putin is finally meeting with a Western leader, although it sounded like the meeting didn't go too well?
No, it was a short meeting. I believe it was only 75 minutes, which is actually considered short for history with Putin as far as his engagements. The difficult part was Austria takes about 80% of their energy from Russia. So, they're in a very critical point, and many other countries, of course, within the European Union and major parts of NATO. So I think it's a pretty interesting strategy. And we see Putin playing this card game and chess game very, very well, is that by trying to connect and have these negotiations and talk about these energy situation, can he cause a crack within the sanctions and the fortitude of NATO and the European nation. I mean, we're also looking at this in France with the vote coming up, is that the possible replacement to Macron, if he doesn't make it, is very sympathetic to Putin. So, you know, they're wondering if France is going to shatter some of this strength against Russia. And I think Austria is very critical on that, on the fuel. And if Putin can do that, hey, that's a great strategy. It's almost like psychological warfare.
Yeah. Glenn, I've got less than a minute remaining, but I want to ask you about China's potential involvement here. Over the weekend, China's military planes delivered what they called a regular shipment of supplies to Serbia. They say it has nothing to do with the current situation in Ukraine, but experts are speculating that the Chinese planes were carrying surface-to-air missiles. What do you make of this exchange?
So an interesting data point is that the surface-to-air missiles and the deal that was done between Serbia and China was actually in 2020. Now, the thing that gets my attention is very interesting how it's being delivered right now during the Ukraine conflict, and it's 2022. However, that agreement was in 2020. So I would be very interested of looking, why wasn't it delivered sooner? It could be manufacturing, I don't know. But the point is that deal was done ahead of time. So it definitely escalates things, but it's one of those things that this was established before, so it may not look as bad as it seems with the Ukraine conflict. But of course, those are weapons going into that theater, so we have to be concerned with anything.
Well, Major Glenn Ignazio, always great to have you on the program. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good night. Nice talking to you again.